Without any further delay, although we do love delaying on this show, let me bring in this guy from the Election Truth Alliance. I've seen a bunch of his stuff, and it tracks. What he says makes a lot of sense, but I think he can walk us through some of the statistics pertaining to the last election. There's certainly questions. I'm not saying that it wasn't legitimate. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, as you know, but I'll definitely take a meeting on the legitimacy of those final vote tallies, particularly when you talk about Donald Trump running the table in the swing states. How about it from Election Truth Alliance, Nathan Taylor, everybody. Hi, Nathan.
Hello. Hey, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, of course.
I'll give a brief
Yeah.
background. Sorry. So for those of you who aren't familiar, my name is Nathan. I'm one of the co-founders. So there was three that helped co-found the Election Truth Alliance, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. And we care about investigating the election, making sure our elections are fair and free and secure. So it's not about, challenging, it's about verifying. So that's very important. This isn't, as you would say, right, this isn't election denial. This is election security. This is insurance. This is, making sure everything is above board, and you do audits. Everyone does audits. So why don't we audit our election?
Bravo. I mean, I think that's exactly right. So tell me give us an overview of what you found or what you surmise based on statistics that you've looked at and the early returns on the numbers. That's why I say statistics. And then then walk us through specifics. Go ahead.
I believe we have a PowerPoint as well. So my background specifically for what I do, civilian side, I'm in cybersecurity, data analysis, and military side, I was a 25 Bravo computer tech specialist in the Army Reserves. Got my degree in network information and security systems, and then commissioned as a signal officer. So radio communications, all the good stuff, satellite. I work in the ETA, and we have some very accredited, very, I would say smarter than me people that all they do is statistics. All they do is simulations. So one of our co-founders, Jive, was one of the ones that kind of dug deeper into our concerns in Clark County, Nevada, and then that blew up to the election as a whole. And so he was actually the one that looked at Clark County and found potential statistical manipulation. And that's where we came up with the Russian tail analysis, which I'll show you. So, all right.
So we just had Nathan knows his stuff, says I24. Thank you for the
I appreciate
super chat. Please listen. So
we
will listen. So
and
Nathan,
questions, I love questions. So just stop me at any time for you, Mark, or anyone in the chat who's got really good questions. Now's the time to, kind of ask these, because I don't have, I put out videos and then I'm jumping back into the data. I'm jumping back into trying to get us a paper audit, any of these swing states, any of these states. That's my big push. If you live in any of the swing states, I need you guys reaching out to your local and state election officials and say, hey, let's do an audit. Let's verify. So that should be a part of our process.
We just had Clark County up there on the screen. Put it back up, and this is part of your PowerPoint, Nathan. Walk us through, and let's.
And I see someone asked, why aren't we doing audits? Why isn't that built in? Generally, it was up until this last election. This election and the one before it, there are certain requirements for a threshold and an automatic recount or an automatic audit. And so in all 7 swing states this time around, and this is why people say this election was over quick. In 2020, there were multiple recounts because of the margins. There were multiple contests. And so there were additional efforts to do audits and compare the paper trail. This time around, every swing state, all 7 swing states outside of the margin of an automatic recount. So it was over pretty quick. Pennsylvania and I think North Carolina were the ones that had to kind of catch up. And you'll notice that when you go back and look.
Yeah, and this is really important what Nathan is saying. There's a threshold which would trigger an audit. And it's interesting that in none of these swing states was that threshold reached. That's not like just a footnote. That is part of the story. Now, go ahead. How about Clark County?
So this is Nevada. They have 2 population centers that are a majority of their vote. That's Clark County, bottom right, the really dark area, and then Washoe County, top left. So these are 2 very important places because these are also your Democrat or your liberal strongholds in the state. And so the reason why we highlight this place is because Clark County put out their cast vote record. It's the digital representation of their votes and how people voted. Clark County specifically, and this might be a little busted on these slides, don't worry about it. So the reason why is their quality in Clark County is really good. They go down to the machine and the type of voting. So we can actually find the ID number on the machine associated with the vote, and early voting, election day, and mail-in. And so that's huge for being able to kind of look at the data and do an analysis. So let's pull back up here, mail-in voting.
Let's try to go through these in the order sort of that they were.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay.
So mail-in voting, there's only 6 tabulators in Clark County, so you can't get a good distribution doing it this way. But what we wanted to kind of highlight is it's not showing any strange correlation when we do some statistical analysis. And Washoe County looks about the same. So for a baseline, you're seeing the Democrats are really leading in mail-in. And that's, people are expected to see that. There's a strong, argument that mail-in is pro-Democrat. They like to vote by mail. So if you go to the next slide, when we were looking at the data, one of the analysis we do specifically is this. This is a binomial distribution. This is a statistical term. Some of you know it as a bell curve. It's just the concept of if you have certain types of data and it's a coin toss in the sense that it's either you got a yes or a no. And in the case of what we're doing, we're arguing that when a voter goes and votes, no matter how they vote, what you should see is they either vote for a candidate or they don't. And so if you pull out Harris or you pull out Trump's distribution, it should be binomial in nature because they either voted for Harris or they voted for something else or they didn't vote. And so what we were seeing in the distribution, we mapped it for multiple vote types and multiple places. So not just Clark County, but we're using Clark County as our baseline to kind of explain why it's concerning and what our analysis potentially shows, and then we'll extrapolate from there. So this is this is election day 2020. This is early voting. And so let me go back and go to election day real quick. And let's highlight.
There you go. Yeah.
The top is just the overlay of both. And what you'll notice is election day almost matches a normal distribution, a bell curve. There's only one little split here at around 50%. Maybe that's an anomaly, maybe that isn't. But if we're looking for this is what you would more expect to see is a normal distribution, binomial distribution. So now we go to early voting. And so this is early voting. Clark County, Nevada has polling locations around the county. They do it a few days, so you can just go in and you don't vote by precinct here. You vote by location, and then it gets correlated because there's an associated number. So you have like a voting ID number that you can potentially use. And so what we found here is when we mapped this distribution, we see it doesn't match a binomial expected distribution whatsoever. And this was concerning. We're like, what would cause this? And as we kind of go back and forth, I've talked to a lot of statisticians that have done election integrity. And the answer I always get is, oh, well, you can't say this is weird. Okay, but what can I say? Well, I can say that when we compare this to every other type of voting, both mail-in and election day, this is the anomaly. This looks weird compared to every other.
For those, Nathan, a lot of people just listen to the show and don't see it. And I'm wondering if we can just give a big podcast audience that just hears the audio. So I just want to describe this bell curve that you were talking about.
Yes. So the way these graphs work and the way you read them is at the bottom of the axis, it's the percent of vote. So we have 2 graphs here. One is for Harris and one is for Trump. And so what we're seeing is the bottom axis, it's 0 up to 100% of the vote. And so what we see is as you grow from 0 up to 20, up to 40, you get a slight curve of the graph growing as a kind of a mountain. And then when you get after around 45%, it actually drops off. And then when you hit 60, it grows and spikes up again. So instead of it being a nice, smooth mountain bell curve, we see this tail for both candidates, and it's just inverted and they're mirroring. Mirroring is expected. That's the whole point, is when we have a 2-party system like we do in the US, you should expect to see one candidate gets 40%, one candidate gets 60%. So it'll mirror.
So in this case, what you're describing, and you can see this, the bottom graph, that tailing is this spike from Trump, of Trump votes. Is that right?
Yes. And what's concerning here is when you're winning, the further right, the more percentage, the more votes you get. So if there was manipulation and this distribution shows concerns of manipulation or some anomaly, it would show in this case that Trump is benefiting from that anomaly, or whatever's happening is impacting Harris's vote. Either way. Now, if we go to the next slide, let me bring up my slide as a representation. if you go one more over, this is actually a down ballot race for early voting. This is the Supreme Court, I believe the state Supreme Court chair races. So they have a bunch. We pulled the C race and the F race. And what we'll find is these also match a binomial distribution. What is important here, the reason why this is a big deal is because this is the same ticket as early voting. So you're telling, and so the presidential race, we're seeing concerns of manipulation. We also did the Senate race. Guess what we're seeing for the Senate race?
I'm guessing you're seeing a normal binomial.
I'm not. We're finding the same tail in Senate. So president and Senate both exhibit the same tail, but every other down ballot race we've looked at, go to the next slide, please.
Got it, Albert?
This is the questions. They have ballot questions. There's 7 in total. We pulled out these 2. More binomial-like distribution. These aren't perfect, but they do match a more expected binomial distribution.
And the binomial thing is just normal bell curve.
Bell curve.
That's what it looks like.
And so for those who are kind of listening, we looked at early voting, and I'm saying the presidential and Senate race both have a weird distribution where there's a spike and it's missing a portion of a bell curve. But then every other race, when we look at the Supreme Court state of Nevada seats, when we look at the ballot questions, they show a bell curve. They show a normal distribution. So now we get into kind of what is this and what does it mean? And this is where we're kind of saying, hey, we've seen this before. As I mentioned, one of the co-founders of the Election Truth Alliance, Jive, he has a ridiculous background in statistician. He's done work for some companies, financial companies and everything. So he knows his numbers. And he found this. He said, hey, I've seen this shape before. I've seen this tail before. 2020 Russian constitutional referendum. This gave Putin additional terms in office where he could extend. Same concern of that distribution not being binomial, having a tail. Go to the next slide. Comparison. Early voting, presidential, Russian tail. So this is where we're highlighting. This is the same potential weirdness in the data, the voting distribution. And so what would cause this? Well, this is where I would argue. Go to the next slide. Oh yeah, one more thing. That was the Georgian Dream Party. So this is in Georgia, the country of Georgia. Same concerns on when you map the data in a expected distribution, looking at party. Same concerns of potential manipulation. This party is accused of being supported or in support of Russia as well. Interesting. Now, here's the fun part. Go to the next slide.
Just to put a sharp edge on it, the statistical anomalies, the tail, the Russian tail, as you say, it is present in all of these different places that you're pointing to.
Yes, different and countries, races, and elections.
Exactly. But I mean, there is a weird congruence between the countries it's showing up in, essentially Georgia and Russia, and now America this last go round. Now, please continue.
Yes. And then now we're going to talk about what would cause this in theory and potential. And so one theory we've tested time and time again, and we have yet to concretely disprove it, is this could be a potential algorithm changing and or deleting votes. So we set out to test this in a statistical analysis to see if we could see it. Clark County, Nevada, as I said, has data down to the lowest level, the tabulation machine. And in that case, that is as clear data as you need to see if there's any potential manipulation going on. And so we set out to test this. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see one representation of doing that. This is a statistical analysis, the same data. This is Clark County. And we're doing it by binning the vote percentages as more votes were cast across multiple machines. Early voting specifically has thousands of machines represented, so we can do this analysis because there are some machines that only got 50 votes cast on them. There's some machines that got over 1,000 up to, I think, 1,250 or so, 1,300 votes. So because we have such a range of data, we can map out how both parties are performing as more votes were cast in different areas. It's not as people voted, but it was as places had more people vote, how did both parties perform? And so the way you read this is at the bottom. It's in bins, meaning it's in groups of 50, I believe. So 0 to over 1,000 different amounts of votes cast. And then the y-axis, the left axis of the graph, is the percentage of both parties getting. So red is Harris, or sorry, blue is Harris and red is Trump. And for those of you who can't see this, it's just a bunch of bars of varying sizes. And so, so what do we see here, Mark? What are your thoughts immediately?
So you're seeing then a candidate in Trump that is beginning to overperform. Is that what I'm getting? Maybe I'm reading this wrong.
No,
but
exactly. So what we notice is from 0 to about 200, 250 votes across multiple machines, both candidates have a different output. Harris is slightly leading after a little bit. I think we lost the graph. And then what is noticeable is after 250 votes across all of these machines, we begin to see this separation. And so when we'll pull this back up here, you'll see, oh, we lost 2 slides. Go back.
Can you go back to where we were, please, Albert? Yeah,
and they all build up on this. What we notice is after in the machines, in the voting locations, in places where more votes were cast, we start to see the amount of votes for Trump increase until about 60%, and it averages out. We start to see Harris lose votes or drop down in votes and not get as much of a percentage. This is concerning. This is specifically concerning because to see this across multiple machines, and it's not just like one place is a spike, one place is different. This is across all the machines in Clark County for early voting.
So again, this is fascinating. So everything's running, it would seem, as per usual through about 60%, you're saying, and then past that, that's when Trump starts to overperform.
So what I'm saying this means, and what we need to validate, and what paper ballots and an audit will show or not show, is there an algorithm that has a threshold of about 200 to 300 votes occurring in Clark County and potentially other places, and we have data for that as well. After that threshold, it begins to change votes from one candidate to the other. And then here's where we get into the math. In order to keep one candidate at 60%, if more votes were cast and you've flipped enough, you start deleting extra votes. And so you're sitting at 60%, you're deleting extra votes to keep that margin. Because if you kept flipping votes, it would just keep going up until you hit 100. So you keep it at 60. And so we were like, okay, so this is kind of what was really concerning, is we can see that happen. If we go one slide over, we'll break down quickly into looking at the distributions and then where else. So election day, right? We're not seeing it here. Next slide, normal distribution. This is Washoe County. We didn't see a lot, but we looked at 2020 and we're like, hey, 2020 for election day is kind of weird for Washoe County. We're seeing that separation that we're seeing for early voting, but in election day here. What's telling is these have different thresholds. These are much lower. These are 140 at most per machine. So if you were to set a threshold based on location and population, it would vary. So Clark County, Nevada. Actually, let's go one more slide back. Let me make this point very briefly. And so if we go back one slide to election day, right, we said, hey, the distribution looks expected, looks normal. Look at how many votes were cast across all of these machines. We're only seeing about 100 at most for 2020, and we're only seeing about 130 to 140 for 24 in election day in Clark County. What's concerning is, as I said, when we looked at Washoe County, we were seeing separation as well in 2020. Now, what's telling is because they have more tabulators in election day and more people voted and spread their vote out, they could have stayed under the threshold for making changes and changing votes. So remember when we
repeat that concept for me. More tabulators. Explain what that is. Okay, go ahead.
So here's what's confusing about the terminology is they're technically voting machines, and then the voting machine data is then taken and put into a tabulator. And so it's the tabulators we're worried about because that's where you would bring all the votes to. But what this data shows is this data shows all the voting locations, all the voting machines where people went cast their votes for election day, and then the other ones show early voting and mail-in. And so what we're concerned about is if you had a threshold and an algorithm that starts changing votes, this would make sense that you're seeing a normal distribution for election day because you're not hitting that threshold because there's more machines and people voted more equally across those machines. Early voting, you see thousands of votes per machine, well past a potential threshold. Okay. Well, so let's see if we can find it. So if you go 2 slides forward, we're going to pull up early voting again. And here's that distribution overlaid in a different way, both 2020 and 2024. And so people have called this the alligator mouth or whatever you want to call it. It's just another way of representing both parties and how their votes are cast, or how many votes they get as more votes were cast on these machines. In 2020, we see a more normal distribution for both candidates up until about 400 to 500 votes cast across the machines. Then we start to see that separation there in 2020 for early voting. And about 500, 550 is really where it starts to become apparent, and it's not as tight or as clear as what we're seeing in 24. So this is interesting. This would potentially mean, if there was an algorithm running on these machines, we're seeing it in 2020 too. Interesting. When we look at 24,
I think. By the way, just as a point, I mean, you know, we keep talking about 2024, but the reality is, what happened in 2020 can be instructive as well. Go ahead.
Well, you say that, and there are some interesting quotes when you look at 2020, specifically about we have to get rid of mail-in ballots, because once you have mail-in ballots, you have crooked elections, as per Trump at the time.
Said that, yeah.
Yeah, that was the Iowa caucus in January. He also, talked about just doing same day voting, and mail-in ballots are fraudulent. And so what's interesting is, as I said, we're only seeing significant manipulation in early voting here. And then in 2020, we were seeing it in election day, but we weren't really seeing it for mail-in. And I find that very interesting with the amount of mail-in votes that were cast in the last election because of COVID. I think it was somewhere around, last numbers was somewhere around 69%. I think 46 was on average across multiple states. Some states had up to 70% mail-in for the Democrats. And so Pennsylvania, which was heavily blue in 2020, that was like 76% mail-in ballots, and Biden won that state. So it's very interesting.
So let me just again step out of the movie for a second to say, if you're then looking at the potential manipulation, the algorithm that is then shifting votes, what Nathan essentially is saying is, and I'm just repeating it just to underscore it, is that the manipulation occurs with the voting tabulation, but not with the voting tabulation of mail-in votes. So the mail-in votes that were dominant in 2020, and as Nathan just noted, carried the state of Pennsylvania for Biden, they weren't messed with, if you want to think of it that way, and you can look at the results and see that. But the potential, anyway, of an algorithm that shifts votes, that's working with all the other votes that are not mail-in. That's essentially what you're saying, correct?
Right.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and that's the concern, is if this was occurring, where is it occurring? So I think if we look at a few other slides here, and we'll just kind of briefly buzz through, that was the big points. If you go to another slide, I believe this is your Senate race. Same concern of manipulation. So as we talked about before, Russian tail in the Senate race for Clark County, Nevada in early voting. This is just another way of representing that. And so if you go one more slide or two more slides, this is where we look at the demographic. And this is where it gets concerning, because if all else fails and you don't trust the statistics, you don't trust the math, we mapped early voting locations in Las Vegas, in Clark County. And so when you actually go and look at the registered parties in this area, Las Vegas is blue. It's absolutely blue. It's ridiculously blue. And we have people who live there who are telling us, hey, it's nothing but blue. And so we're seeing in these early voting locations where more votes were cast, the Republican parties actually start to exceed the amount of Democrat votes cast there. And so, as I said, we're seeing places where there are over 5,000 to 8,000 leading votes for the Republican Party in the middle of Las Vegas. And that just seems a little ridiculous. And it would correlate the concept of if you had a vote changing algorithm that starts taking and deleting votes after a certain threshold, it doesn't care about the demographics of the people there. It just cares about changing votes. So any thoughts on this?
It's extraordinary. I mean, these are the sorts of anomalies that get eyebrows raised, but yes. I feel as though you've you've come with some of the math as to how it might be done, particularly when you look at the disparity between the voting machines and the mail-in. I feel that's really compelling just on its face.
And I have more, and I'll run through the last ones here. If you go to the next slide, when we talked about if this was occurring, what are some symptoms, right? If you were changing votes or deleting votes across not just Clark County, Nevada, but all 7 swing states and other states as well, if the vote tabulation machines are compromised, where could it have occurred, and what are some signs of it occurring? And so this is where you've probably heard of drop-off. Are you familiar?
That's like the bullet ballots. Is that what you mean? Or?
Yes and no. So Stephen Spoonamore kind of coined the term a bullet ballot in the beginning because we couldn't pull the data out. And so what he saw, and he was right, and what got misinterpreted is he was talking about, hey, Trump is exceeding over his next down ballot candidate by a lot. And he was worried that those were fake votes or synthetic votes getting fed in. Well, what we're seeing now is when we look at the actual data and we look at both parties and compare, we're seeing drop-off abnormalities from the presidential race to the Senate race to a lower race. And what that means is, let's say, the president gets 50 votes and the Senate gets 75 votes. That's strange, because why is the senator overperforming the president? And if we see that consistently across multiple counties and multiple states, it raises eyebrows, as you said, right? And so what we're worried is a significant manipulation where votes were changed from the presidential race from one party to the other would cause a noticeable drop-off anomaly across the state, across multiple counties. And so we're like, all right, if there was a vote-changing algorithm, and if it was just changing votes or deleting votes from the presidential race and maybe left the Senate race alone in some places, do we see drop-off anomalies across multiple states? So if you go to the next slide, we're going to talk about drop-off anomalies real quick. Here's your quick graph. Here's your analysis. Smart Elections, another nonprofit election integrity organization that's been doing this for a long time. Lulu, she's amazing. I've talked to her. I've worked with her a few times, and we still are talking and exchanging information and trying to figure out what's going on. But this is their work. They published this graph, and what it shows is the swing states, 7 swing states. It looks at how many votes did the president get compared to the next down ballot race, which is the Senate. So 0% is the senator's performance. So when you look at this graph, you see that the Democratic presidential candidate, on average across the 7 swing states, was negative 1.48%. On the other hand, the Republican candidate was positive 5.58%. That means they got over 5% more votes on average than their Senate candidate of the same party. What's strange is when we look at non-swing states and we average it out, we see both of them sit closer to 1 to 2% positive. So why is the Democratic presidential candidate underperforming in the swing states? Right? That's concerning.
To me, this is the whole game to me.
This is the whole game.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. If you're going to win an election, you target the swing states. Those are what will, flip one way or the other. And what's very concerning is we looked at Wisconsin, Arizona, North Carolina, and we're seeing that significant drop off for one candidate, and then one other candidate is overperforming by a ridiculous amount. So we broke this down a little more for you. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see we graphed it. And Smart Elections has done the same thing. We've done the same thing. And here's Ohio, 24, president to Senate, both parties. 0% is the Senate votes for both parties. So if you're above the line, you got more votes. If you're below the line, you got less votes. In every county in Ohio, in 24, the Democrats got less votes than their next down ballot race, the Senate, and the Republicans at the presidential level got more votes. When we look at 2016, you see what we argue is a more expected pattern of some change between county to county. These are swing states. That's the whole point, is they have populations that are heavily left, heavily right. And so
you'd expect sort of an interspersed kind of above the line, below the line. So if you're just looking at it that way, you can just see top to bottom how there's no intersperse on the top graph.
And drop off isn't a great analysis in the terms of it's not going to tell you anything. But when you map it out and you look at how consistent it is, when we look at 24, we argue this is a non-human consistency in voting pattern. 2016 looks more human because those populations change and they don't all stay in line. So that's the thing, is drop off alone can't really show anything. But if there was a vote changing algorithm, then drop off would be a symptom if there was vote changes occurring and causing this non-human pattern. So we go to the next slide and we'll breeze through these last few here.
Yeah, I've got it.
We see two more forward. Arizona, same concerns, a little more wishy-washy in 2020, but same concerns in 24. Consistency across counties. Next. Wisconsin, same concerns. There are a couple counties that we see the inverse, and that's one thing we want to jump into, is we want to look at these counties where there was a positive drop-off for one candidate or the other and see, what's going on there. But we've done some analysis in some of these places like Dane County, and we have concerns there as well. But on average, you see that more consistent underperformance. 2016, it's a little more back and forth. Next slide. Minnesota. I don't know what to say here. That's pretty obvious.
This is extraordinary. I mean,
it's extraordinary.
But again, if you're just listening, I mean, the difference between 2024 and 2020 in Minnesota is dramatic. I mean, there's just, again, if you just look at it sort of as the interspersal of the of drop off, there is none in 2024.
Yeah, it's almost both candidates are generally positive in 2020. And then 24 is just one candidate heavily underperforming, the other candidate heavily overperforming. Here's a key note as well, is when you look at how much one candidate underperforms compared to the other, you will find that the underperformance is always less than the overperformance. So if there was a vote changing algorithm and you were changing votes from one candidate to the other, from presidential, this would correlate because you're changing more vote, or you're changing less votes than what was happening. So that would make sense. And so that margin of overperformance is more than what was taken from the other candidate potentially. And so it would fit in, it would support that. I would expect to see maybe 2% overperformance for both parties, depending on, on average. So for one party to overperform by, in this case in Minnesota, I think we're looking at something like on average 10% overperformance for Trump, and something along the lines of, an equal amount of underperformance. This is comparing president to Senate. Yep. All right.
I wanted to just to take this this question. Dennis says the smoking gun may be at ES&S voting hardware, where two insiders allegedly stole source code. And Tina Peters in Colorado. Can you explain this question and then answer it, please?
Yeah, I can talk about the concerns. One thing we always want to be aware of is, because of the last election and the 4 years following, you don't want to directly discredit a company or a vote counting system. Now, I can say there has been multiple concerns from cybersecurity individuals talking about potential compromise of our two main types of tabulation machines. And so those sadly, I've got to wrap up here, but give me 2 minutes to stick the landing on that, because really this gets to how would this possibly have been done. Yes. So. All right. Let's go 6 slides forward for me. We have a graph of 70% of voting equipment is compromised, theoretically. And I'll show you those distributions. Keep going. One more, maybe. 2 more. Oh, one back. All right. I'll finish on these last 2. Here's your vote tabulation machines. They cover 70% of the U.S. They cover the swing states. They cover non-swing states. And what's interesting is everywhere we've looked and we've seen concerns of manipulation, these 2 types of machines are used. And and if you do a little bit of research, you'll find what these 2 brands are specifically, and you'll find that both have concerns of potential compromise, whether it's having gained access to the image or potential cellular modem access in the machines. It doesn't really matter how you could have done this. It matters that they are there and they are distributed across the US, and they would have an impact if there was a vote changing algorithm and these machines were compromised and that was running. You would have been able to pull off manipulating the election. You would have been able to win the 7 swing states in a straight way, And so what's concerning is, you go to the next slide, we look at the change from 2020 to 24. And if these numbers are right, and we'll need to go back and double check and see if there's not been any additional changes, but 88 counties changed from blue to red this election. 0 counties changed from red to blue this election. That is That is improbable, realistically. Even in other races where someone absolutely swept multiple states, I think it was 1984, Ronald Reagan, he won 49 out of 50 states, and 30 counties were still flipped blue for his opposition party. So for you to flip 0 counties and only get, I think, what was the total count? Somewhere around 30 something states. I'll have to verify, but you were nowhere close to winning at that level, and yet 0 counties flipped. And you only got 49.8% of the popular vote. You're under 50%.
Sure.
It's very suspicious. So.
Yeah, and by the way, when we say suspicious, you're talking about statistically. That's what I like about your analysis. It's statistically suspicious. Yep. This isn't a question of, politics. Go ahead.
I think the statistical probability of winning 7 swing states outside of the margin of a recount and with less than 50% of the popular vote is statistically improbable. Like, it would never occur naturally. It would require you to only win in such targeted ways where you get just enough votes in the places that matter. It's a little strange. So, and I'll wrap up with the next. There's 2 more slides, one after this. So skip one, and then I think we'll wrap up, and I'll take just any questions or anything. So this one is, people are like, hey, drop off vote, unpopularity for Harris, right? That's what we're talking about. That's what the argument is people didn't like candidate Harris. They didn't vote for her. Well, when you run the numbers, she actually exceeded Biden's 2020 numbers in Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Georgia. And she got, across the 7 swing states, 99.6% of the votes cast. So this doesn't correlate with the amount of drop-off we're seeing in some of these states. It's very concerning. And if you go to the next slide, this is where we talk about big picture. Why does this matter, right? So here's the concern. If there was a vote-changing algorithm running on our tabulation machines, as we suspect, and as the data continues to point to the potential likelihood of it and the means of doing it, it's all been laid out. What's concerning is we did the numbers and saying if 2%, as we saw outside the swing states on average, is what you would expect a presidential candidate to get. So the top right graph here is votes across the 7 swing states right now. The reported totals. We see Trump is leading in all 7. Harris is closely behind by different values, but underneath. What's concerning is if we were to say a certain threshold because of drop-off was potentially flipped votes, we ran the numbers, we gave a rough estimate, we underestimated as much as we could. It was still looking around 1.5 million potentially flipped votes in just 6 swing states. And when we invert those, we find that Harris wins those 6 swing states if those votes were changed from one candidate to the other. Now, here's 2 final points I want to make. This is not including voter suppression, which Greg Palast has highlighted, and I agree 100% with him. Mail-in voting was heavily suppressed. I still have people telling me and sending me, hey, I went and checked my mail-in and it never got counted. It never got delivered. Here's another concern. When we look at the way the algorithm potentially works, we're looking at votes being deleted as well. And we don't have an accurate or potentially accurate estimate for how many votes could have been manipulated and deleted. So this is not including mail-in suppression. This isn't including people being disenfranchised from their voting rolls. This isn't including all of these other things. This is just if votes were being changed, not deleted, not cast, not thrown out. And so it is a big deal. And I believe I'll wrap up here. And let's go one more slide.
Yeah, I've got
here's
only
your big
30
picture,
seconds. Right? So quickly, give me
here's your big picture. Why now, right? Are we going to get audits? Are we going to get recounts? Recounts aren't feasible because of our election laws, but we can have audits. We can have audits in the swing states because if our machines are compromised, the midterms won't be free and fair. The next election, there will be no, we'll get them in the next time. There will be no, hey, 4 years, right? Our democracy requires that our voices are heard. That's built into the Constitution. That's the whole point. And if our voices and our votes are not being counted, we should be upset. We should be looking into this. This is a big deal. So,
I love it. I completely agree. And I am very much of the belief that just what you've said on the midterms and on the next general, the methodology by which they potentially manipulated votes is still there. It's proven effective, and they've done it within thresholds so that you won't get a recount because of those thresholds. And obviously, we've got a Democratic Party, it seems, that is sitting on its hands through all of this. Partially, I would say, because it's kind of become a radioactive call to say, I deny the result or I want to recount because of what happened in 2020. So the Democrats don't want to be considered that way. They don't want that kind of stink on them. So they, it makes no sense to me. I mean, it's much too big. The stakes are far too great, but that's where we are. I've got to wrap up. And so we'll have to do a Q&A another time. Yeah. But I do want to mention, can you put Nathan's website up?
Yeah, go to the last slide there,
website.
And you can see it. So it's, it might not be on the bottom, but electiontruthAlliance.org, super easy to find. We have a YouTube as well. And so electiontruthAlliance.org. And great stuff on your YouTube channel as well. So check him out, Election Truth Alliance. And I so appreciate you spending time with us. Thank you so much.
There's a lot here. And I encourage everybody not only to listen to what Nathan says, but you can go back. Yeah, there it is. We've got it up. You can go back over this video and you can replay and blow up those graphs even bigger. So
and as we said, we're pushing for audits. We're pushing for paper trail audits. And so, you know, if you can support us in that way, that'd be awesome.
Come visit again, Nathan. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. All right. Nathan Taylor, everybody. Thank you.